Once again, friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our symposium this afternoon. Allow me to introduce our third speaker. He is Professor Dr. Helmut Zander, Professor of Religious Studies in the Faculty of Catholic Theology, University of Freiburg, Switzerland. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Catholic Theology and a Doctor of Philosophy in Political Science. Our professor speaker this afternoon is a Bert Brecht Visiting Professor of History at the University of Augsburg in 2009 and a Research Fellow of the Graduate School Locating Media, hosted by the University of Siegen in 2008. He was also appointed Substitute Visiting Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Zurich in 2009 and 2010, and Substitute Visiting Professor of History of Science at Humboldt University in 2006. Our distinguished speaker has coordinated and participated in several publicly sponsored research projects at different institutions. He specializes in the study of the history of religions and esotericism. His major research focus is on the history of anthroposophy in Germany. Lately, he acquired a further research interest in the field of media studies. He also worked on the conceptualization of a European history of religions from a comparative perspective. To speak on comparative theology, reflections on the new role of religious studies for the interreligious dialogue. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Dr. Helmut Zander from the University of Freiburg, Switzerland.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for the warm invitation and the interesting days I could spend here in Manila, especially with the help of Joel Sigurd. Let me start with a very practical question. Do you have got a handout? Fine. And those who are online, you might follow the main information on the screen. I hope this conference will be a starting point for further cooperation between Dominican institutions and universities of Freiburg, Manila, and Ibadan. We may discuss a lot of topics, but today we are starting with a central topic in the globalized world, the relationship between religions. I would like to explain today the following thesis. The first step in an interreligious dialogue must be an intentionally neutral perception of the other, of the partners in dialogue. And I try to explain what I mean with intentionally neutral. This means, briefly spoken, judgments, in our case theological judgments, are not eliminated but have to be complemented by religious studies. I'll start, and you give me the first slide, with the problem to which comparative theology proposes a solution, and you see 4 other points which shall follow indicated on the screen. I would like to introduce you in this field, in this first paragraph, into the relatively new field of comparative theology as one part of the theology of religion. I start with a statement of the problem using one of the most important texts of the Catholic Church in this field, the Declaration Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council from 1964, and many of you probably know these texts. Here, the Council reacted to globalization, decolonization, and increased processes of religious exchange. Nostra Aetate was, in my perspective, a revolution that subjected 1,500 years of Christian history to a revision. And I want to quote a central part of this text. Ecclesia Catholica nihil eorum que in his religionibus vera et sancta sunt reitit. In English, the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. These religions were meant to be Buddhism and Hinduism. The text speaks an interesting detail about Islam only later. But this sentence, which I quoted, is immediately followed by the sentence, I quote, "The Church proclaims Christ, the way, the truth, and the life." With these two sentences, the claim of Christianity and the recognition of other religions are in the same room on the table. For me, this tension, which I see between these two sentences, this tension indicates a great theology which is able to endure the tensions of dogmatic theology and not to equalize them lightly. What is also important about the text is what has not been said. The document does not refer, even in the notes, to an older normative sentence of Catholic tradition. Ecclesia extra ecclesiam nulla salus. There is no salvation out of the church. I would say, not reading this sentence, this means a partial revision of Catholic tradition by concealment, which is an interesting way to deal with dogmatic contents. This aperture to other religions was so offensive that it was one of the reasons that Catholics around Bishop Marcel Lefebvre, and you find all the names which I mentioned on your handout, that he and his group broke with Rome. I believe that this sentence was groundbreaking and necessary, as mentioned, a revolution, but for him it was unable to stay in the church in fully communion with Rome. But without this sentence, a dialogue with other religions as we practice it today as a matter of course would not have been possible. Nevertheless, almost after 60 years, this text has taken on a patina. I use Buddhism as an example. The text states, and another quotation, Buddhism, I quote, in its various forms realizes the radical insufficiency of this changeable world. It teaches a way by which man, in a devout and confident spirit, may be able either to acquire the state of perfect liberation or attain, by their own efforts or through higher help, supreme illumination. Anyone who has ever been to a Buddhist country immediately sees what is missing here. Passage rites and practice in temple, they are not mentioned, but these practices are precisely what form the center of Buddhist life. And there is an explanation why these elements are missing in the text. In the 1960s, Buddhism was perceived strongly as a philosophical religion. Zen was main part in the perception of Europeans, and this was considered the challenge, not the practice in the temple. And in this context, Buddhism was seen as illumination, a term which is near to enlightenment and thus a part of Western semantics, which is, in our current perspective, just not appropriate. because Buddhists don't seek enlightenment but liberation from thoughts, contexts. But there is, again, an explanation why the text of the Vatican Council uses this terminology. The text was written, the first text, by the Jesuit Heinrich Dumoulin, who lived in Japan. He had become acquainted with Zen Buddhism. This is the background of this text. We would have similar problem with the section on Islam. In the text which you find on your handout, Mohammed is not mentioned. The text fits Sunni rather than Shiite Islam. And Sufis do not appear. And there is an answer for this as well. Sunnis are not mentioned because they were a political problem in the 1960s. In 1966, the mastermind of Islamism, Sayyid Qutb, was executed in Egypt. And here too, we can understand why this text of the Council was written in this way. The first text was written by a Dominican, George Anawati, who lived in Egypt and who had exactly these problems in mind. Now, why I'm trying to entrance in this problem, speaking about Nostra Aetate. I'm interested in a fundamental problem, the problem of normativity. The look at other religions in Nostra Aetate is an appreciative look, that's clear. But even an appreciative look remains normative. But above all these evaluations, even if they are full of appreciation, are inappropriate. And this brings me to the problem I mentioned at the beginning of my thesis, the relationship between neutral and normative perception. Here, comparative theology offers a way out, and I would like to outline this perspective in the following thoughts. In my second chapter, I present some features of comparative theology, and in the third one, I try to explain where we need to develop it further. Now, chapter 2. Thanks. In the second half of the 20th century, new theologies of religion emerged, ultimately of three types: exclusivist, inclusivist, and pluralistic. And we may go into detail, but I think they are no more usable. Each variant has such major problems that we need a new approach. And because they are deeply charged with normative values. That's the problem that I tried to explain in Nostra Aetate. We have to raise new questions. What role do the aspects we perceive play in the self-perception of others? Ultimately, do we adequately comprehend the other religion at all? I think not, and that's the reason for a new approach. It emerged in the 1990s, and I described the approach in particular with the work of Klaus von Stosch, since 2021 Professor of Systematic Theology at the Catholic Faculty of the University of Bonn, Germany. I will quickly notice that comparative theology is not finished, and I offer you some elements of a new toolbox. The considerations which I present are therefore primarily heuristic and not definitely systematic. Von Stosch assumes that there is truth. That's an important point of departure. He does not find it in the everyman's land of religious philosophy, but in his own religious tradition in the Catholic Church. Secondly, he demands epistemolic humility. if there can be truth and holiness in other religions, as the Vatican Council II mentions, we might learn from them. One can offer hospitality to another religion. One can let oneself be affected. One can, with an early Dominican, Matthew Arcano, regard another religion as a locus alienus, as a foreign place for my own knowledge. Such an attitude does not see the other religion primarily as opponent, but with empathy. Methodically, von Stosch proposes a micrological turn. That means he refuses to view religions as totality. Religions are too complex, too diverse. What, for example, is the Catholic Church? Charismatic Catholics in the Philippines, Trappist monks in Switzerland, Pope Francis in Rome. And the same is for Islam. What is representative for Islam? Sufis, Ibn Arabi, contemporary theologian Muhammad Akun, Sayyid Qutb. If religions are too complex, we need to look at details in the encounter, not at the ensemble. That means we have to look on contexts. Third point of von Stosch, in terms of methods, he suggests considering whether we might need a third person in the procedure of comparative theology, perhaps the representative of a third religion, perhaps an agnostic, or perhaps an unbeliever. The explanation is that the third eye will be something where two people see something, where two people are blind. What are the results of such a procedure? First, we can better stand another person or another religion. But a second result follows on its heels. One can better understand one's own religion. If I see my own tradition through the eyes of another tradition, I will discover something new. This includes, as Marianne Moyard, a Catholic theologian in Belgium, who also researches comparative theology, has made evident in an astute philosophical work. We have to get to know our own vulnerability and learn to accept it. She interprets this with the theology of the cross. If Jesus himself made himself vulnerable, why should this not apply to us? What can this learning look like? An example. In the encounter with Islam, the question of Trinity arises. Quickly, it becomes a marker of Christian Catholic theology in the interreligious dialogue. But do we remember that God is not Trinitarian, but we try to understand his relationship to the world, to the people, with the term Trinity. But God is a mystery, and our language is limited, always. Christians in Islamic countries often have conceived God much more sovereign, transcendent, incomprehensible. In the tradition of late antique polemics, one could say they have conceived him as more Aryan. Now we had to ask, what might this Aryan, schismatic, heretic perspective in traditional theology mean with regard to Islam? If Christians in these countries adopt this perspective, and perhaps they know God a bit better, more transcendent, more mysterious than the traditions than the Nicene traditions. And von Stosch tried to do something very new. He wrote a book on Jesus in the Quran together with a Muslim theologian. That means they really wrote the text together and not one part from one theologian and the other part from the other one. Unfortunately, currently this book is available only in German. And they always raise the question, might Muslims understand at least one aspect of God better than we do today? Now I have a very small look on, well, some theologians doing comparative theology, and it's perhaps for those who are a bit advanced in their theological studies. If you are quite new, you may take a 3-minute break out. Among the early proponents, we find two non-Catholics, the Methodist Robert Cummings Neville and the Anglican Keith Ward. They differ from Catholic theologians, and mostly comparative theologians are Catholics. The two differ in one point. They want to speak from a position outside of their denomination, not like von Stosch, from within. Then there is James L. Fredericks, priest of the Archdiocese of San Francisco and dogmatist at Loyola University in the States. He starts, like very much approaches in comparative theology, with Christology. He proposes to expand the concept of a person, which is too narrow for God in his conception, with suggestions from the Buddhist monk Dogen. He proposes a relational ontology that wants to understand personhood as the, I quote, original participation of the person in the Buddha nature. Just a hint on how to change our anthropology in this perspective. Then we have the Jesuit Francis Clooney, now at Harvard in the USA, a specialist on Hinduism. He rejects the theology of religion, the classical one, because this already is a theology from a Christian perspective. Mostly Christians invented different forms of religious theology. For him, too, comparative theology means to learn from other religions. Then Catherine Cornell at Boston College, who has written a book in 2020 that is the first scholarly synopsis of the debate on comparative theology, meaning and method in comparative theology. And last year, Klaus von Stosch has presented another introduction for students, but in German. Finally, the aforementioned Marianne Moyart, in which she reflects on the, I quote, fragility of interreligious encounters in her discussion with French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. Her central thesis, we must be a vulnerable self, not a Cartesian self, not a master self defined by cogito ergo sum, just because I think I am. We are men, women, because we are in relation with others. And this includes for her to be vulnerable. To summarize this second chapter, the easiest way to understand comparative theology is to see what it does not want to be. Not an exclusivist theology that excludes others from sake on principle. Not an inclusivist theology that does not perceive the otherness of others. Not a pluralist theology in which no truth claims are taken seriously and all cats are gray. Positively speaking, it wants to take the others seriously in their otherness, is willing to learn from them, and does not want to give away the claim to truth in our own, here, Catholic tradition. And I think that's a position quite near to what Brother Cecil mentioned in the first lecture. It wants to do theology out of dialogue, not for the dialogue. But as I said, it's still in the making. Third chapter, comparison as an epistemological problem. I think if we do theology, we have always to reflect on methods and epistemology. These are our context, our starting points that frame our thoughts. And there are two small blanks. The first one, and that we heard in the second lecture, is the post-colonial perspective. It has hardly been discussed yet, but of course the question of power, of hierarchies, of ambiguities, and of not balanced relations are a main problem. The second blank is the question of gender. What happens if we raise the question of gender with regard to Christology? But that's only for indication. The biggest construction site is comparison. Although comparative studies is a guiding concept of comparative theology, it has hardly been reflected upon as such. But, and that's a great problem, comparison is not neutral. That's no neutral method. Epistemologically, we always perceive by comparing. There is no alternative to comparison. But comparing means always identifying differences and similarities at least two objects. And in addition, we take a standpoint beyond the two compared objects by constructing a tertium comparationis. That's clear, that's something like basic knowledge in comparison. But, and this was mentioned by Brother Cecil as well, theologically was decidedly hostile to comparison. The reason was a theological one. When I compare religions with each other, I relativize truth claims. Christian theology considered itself in many cases, and to varying degrees of course, to be the absolute and final revelation of God, and thus incomparable. We should stick to that claim, but what are the consequences for the dialogue? Anyway, theology feared relativism. I think one way out is to realize that comparison is no absolute method. As I mentioned, a comparison is not neutral, but highly normatively charged. Religious studies have a long time assumed that comparison is a mere method and insofar neutral, but that's not the case. For example, religious studies had to realize that it was working with a Christian concept of religion or a Christian concept of faith. It's definitely difficult, for example, to translate faith into Arabic or into Sanskrit. You meet a lot of terms which are quite far away from the Christian context of faith. So the crucial question is, how can neutrality in comparison be established? My answer is not at all. The only option is an asymptotic neutrality, and that was my first sentence, an intentional neutrality. That means we must constantly reflect on our own normative elements. You can't eliminate normativity, but at least you can minimize it. That's more or less the final conclusion. Now I would like to come to the fourth chapter, which is only a short resume of my thoughts in 7 theses, 7 consequences, which you find on the handout and here later on the screen. And I ask you to become engaged in criticizing me and discussing the items and perhaps the consequences of comparative theology. First point. Comparative theology aims at understanding the other in her or his particular difference. We can no longer, as in the Second Vatican Council, think about Buddhism without the practice in the temple, not about Islam without reflecting on the role of Sufi sheikhs or on the important role of Mohammed in lived theology. Second point, theology needs comparative studies to perceive commonalities in religion, but in my perspective, it should contribute more to the perception of differences. In comparison, Christians learn that they are different and to what extent the others are different. Third point, comparative theology begins with methods which are intentionally neutral, applying methods of cultural studies, of religious studies. That means historical, critical, textual analysis, sociological and ethnological approaches. I think in theology we have to get better at this. This first step should happen before entering the normative debate in the interreligious dialogue, which is ultimately the debate about truth. Fourth point, we ought to realize that comparative theology is in any step normative. There is no non-normative approach in religion and religious studies. Fifth point, with its normative impact, comparative theology remains Catholic theology. It doesn't become some kind of Christian theology or a kind of religious studies. And hopefully we will have Muslim comparative theology and in Buddhist studies and Buddhist traditions also an access to comparative whatsoever. I don't use the term theology because it's difficult for Buddhist traditions. Sixth point, comparative theology invites to accept our own vulnerability. I think we are strong when we can realize that we can be weak. Last point, comparative theology should learn from others, from other religious traditions, ultimately, and that's in a Catholic perspective, Christian perspective, because God created all people. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Zander. Dr. Zander underscored that comparative theology is Catholic theology, and that he brought to the table some key features of comparative theology, highlighting taking the others in their otherness and learning from one another, and how some new approaches and new questions applying neutral perception methods may be further developed in our understanding and perception of and dialogue with the others. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Dr. Zander. At this point, we open our session with some questions, but as we may have known, we are holding this symposium via HiFlex format. So we beg the indulgence of those who are joining us from Zoom, via Zoom. Please allow us a few minutes to set up some tables and chairs in front for our speakers as we prepare for the open forum. May we invite those who are attending via Zoom to type in your questions. Please identify yourself and your affiliation, your name and your affiliation, and to whom you'd like to direct your question to. We also would like to invite our friends who are attending live here from the University of Santo Tomas. for some questions. If you would like to raise a question or concern, any remarks about our topics this afternoon, please just raise your hand for you to be acknowledged. And again, please identify yourself, state your name and your affiliation. Thank you. Do you have someone from this assembly would like to raise his question? Our speakers are now ready to answer our questions. Co-moderating with me via Zoom is Ms. Lucielle De Leon from the Institute of Religion. Ma'am Lucielle, do we have some questions there in the chat box?
Good afternoon, Ma'am Joanne. Yes, we have 4 questions that we will entertain today. And of course, there are still questions that are ongoing on our chat box. May I start now for our first question?
Yes, ma'am, please.
For our first question, our speakers, any of you may answer this question. Would it be possible that a novel theological understanding on magisterial and ecclesial teachings might emerge out of a genuine dialogue with other cultures and traditions without compromising the church-owned doctrines? Once again, would it be possible that a novel theological understanding on magisterial and ecclesial teachings might emerge out of a genuine dialogue with other cultures and traditions without compromising the church-owned doctrines?
Yes, Dr. Zander, please, or Dr. Basas.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you
Okay.
loud and clear. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this question, which goes absolutely to the center of the problems. And you ask, can it be possible? And this question invites to answer yes or no. And I would say I can't answer this question with yes or no. Why? The problem cannot be solved with a binary frame. We have a definite tension in our theology. And that's for me the intriguing, the interesting part of theology, that we enter in an open space. We have a truth claim as Christians and Catholics that's absolute. On the other hand, it's clear that we know, as the Vatican Council said, that there are things which are true and holy in other religions. And therefore, it's difficult for me to answer your questions with yes and no, but, well, even the magisterial decisions or discussions have to look for a way how to come to a position which does not compromise Catholic positions and is also adequate in perceiving non-Catholic, non-Christian traditions. So my answer would be yes and no. It would be possible to integrate this perspective in a magisterial perspective if we realize the complexity of our answers. And it would not be possible to integrate it if we stick to a perspective that only knows black and white, right or wrong.
Thank you very much. Dr. Basas, please.
Hello. Over the course of many years, what we can discern is that the church has always been circumspect in terms of coming up with methods or theological methods in order to address the problems of each time. And of course, after the Second Vatican Council, we see a radical shift in the way that theologizing is done. And I think the Second Vatican Council sets a kind of different tone which in a way tries to balance historical realities and theological constants. But we just have to be patient because, for example, we cannot ask the church to change her teachings just like that at the whim of others. Everything has to be done in a patient and a gradual way, always mindful of what is at stake in the process, and always mindful that both the human person asking for change and the church that is in charge of the faith, they both have something to protect. So it always requires a whole lot of reflection. And in our time, we are very glad that the call for dialogue, the call for accompaniment has become the buzzwords. And I think these are starting points if we are looking for an emerging way of doing theology.
Thank you very much. Do you have other questions from the floor? Yes, please, sir. Kindly identify yourself.
Good afternoon to our speakers. Thank you for your thoughts. I am Bro Noel Salvacion, a former faculty of De La Salle University, Theology, and the director of Kairos. Corollary to the first question, gentlemen, fathers, while we applaud the noble intention of global Catholicism, my question is, how can we better our experience or deepen our experience of God? How can we rehabilitate then our uncompromised dogmas in the language of difference and dialogue these days? How can we better enrich our experience of God then? Professor Zander?
Thank you for this important question. When we started with comparative Catholicism, I had the idea, well, we are a global player and we should think about that. And then arriving in Manila, on the Philippines, for the first time in my life, my little architecture broke. You know, the Philippines are totally different than in my imagination. Everything runs in a way that I didn't expect to happen. And perhaps my analphabetism concerning the knowledge of other Catholic cultures becomes quite obvious. And my first answer would be, we have to encounter each other. Catholic traditions are extremely different, and I had not the chance from a European perspective to understand what's going on here. You may read texts, you may, well, discuss by Zoom, and we should do this, but that can only be a first step. And discussing just this morning different perspectives, for example, on synodality. And as we heard here in the contributions, one real great problem is the question of the poor, as you mentioned it, and what to do in this situation. In Switzerland, the question of poor is not a really important question. A question which we are treating as, for example, what's with the role of women? Can they be ordained to deacons or priests? And we are realizing that women are leaving the church because it doesn't correspond to our Western form of emancipation. So we both have the aim to go a way of synodality, but the claims are totally different. And we have to see that that's a real problem and a richness in the global perspective. We in Switzerland might learn from you that the question of poverty is not solved. It is a problem on the global level. It's a problem here and in other countries. And perhaps you might understand that we in Switzerland have different questions on the table. And, well, to have first knowledge of these great differences in one church, that's a really great progress we might have. And I'm just learning more than I expected to learn here in these days in Manila.
I don't know how you will appreciate what I'm going to tell you, sir, but our task, and it depends which theology you are. I mean, it depends on what theological method you are employing here. But I'd like to recall what a Dominican said, Father Francisco Marinsola. Our task is to safeguard the faith. But we do so, and we do so by explaining it. In other words, we have a particular aspect of our faith, and as I've said, our task is to explain and expound it. Can we change it? Can we add something to it? St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure said, if I remember it right, you can add. You can add, but for as long as what you are adding is homogeneous to the revealed datum. If what you are adding is something that will change it in a transformistic way, then that might not be the right way of doing it. Again, that's one aspect of doing theology, because as I've said, over the course of many years, there are many modes of theologizing that emerge. There are those that are really appreciative of how we are preserving the homogeneity of the Catholic faith, but there are those who, in a radical way, would like to change it, and by change, I mean transformistically. And so we look at modalities like, for example, contextual theology, enculturation or intercultural theology, adaptation, and so forth and so on. If we appreciate the way in which all of this have emerged over the course of time, we can see how the Church has been sincere in her efforts to reach out to people in cultures, in their contexts. It's just that there are really some aspects that maybe more time is needed for theologies to evolve in response to this. But across the board, it is respect for all that is being given by the Church in her explanations.
Thank you very much, doctors.
Thank you.
From the two responses of our speakers to the first two questions, our key takeaways could be there is really no single best method in doing theology, but a culture of encounter, culture of dialogue, and culture of accompaniment. Do we still have questions from the chat box, Ms. Marielle or Ms. Luziel?
Thank you, Ma'am Joanne. Yes, we have another question from our chat box, and this could be answered by both of our speakers. What does the term Church of the Poor mean in the context of dialogue? It seems to me that we do not address all the needs of the poor. Shouldn't be better to identify our church as Church of all and for all? Once again, what does the term Church of the Poor mean in the context of dialogue? It seems to me that we do not address all the needs of the poor. Shouldn't be better to identify our church as Church of all and for all?
Anyone, please? Yes, Dr. Basas.
Dialogue is a constant in the Church's relationship with the poor. We see that in the Second Vatican Council, in how she expressed preferential option for the poor, and in the Second Plenary Council of the Philippines, and how she said that the church in the Philippines should be a church of the poor. Now, you are correct in saying that we are not addressing the problems of the poor. In fact, the Second Plenary Council of the Philippines has admitted this after following the reports of the National Pastoral Consultation on Church Renewal. And so, in light of this, the problem is not so much with the teachings of the church, but with our dispositions or our attitudes as believers. That's why the first call of the Second Plenary Council of the Philippines, for example, for us to be able to be really true witnesses of the Church of the Poor is to conscientize us. And how have we been responding to that conscientization? So that I would say the church is always in dialogue, not just with the poor, but with all sectors of society. But we give preferential option for the poor because they are the ones who are most in need in our society. Now, can we address all the political concerns or all the economic concerns of the people? That's not the concern of the church. That's not the primary purpose of her existence. Although in her ministry, she tries her best to address even these things. So dialogue is always there. The church is in constant communion with the poor. We can see that expressed in many different ways. But will there be Will there be gaps? Definitely, there will be gaps because the problem of the poor is so encompassing. And when will that change? Maybe in the second coming of Christ, because you go back to biblical times, that's their problem already. And in our time, it's still our problem. What religion will be able to change that? I don't know.
Dr. Zander, you might want to add something.
Yeah, church of all, that's perhaps the shortest definition of Catholicism. And the Greek meaning of the word, it's exactly that. And you are quite right to point to this point. That's a perspective we are not allowed to lose. But the question is what to do in a concrete situation. And that might be for the Philippines, the question of the poor. For Switzerland, that might be the question of refugees in this country. And so you have to look what's really the need in a contextual, in a special situation. And you in the Philippines, you don't need any advice from Switzerland, but you have to search for your problem, what's perhaps the first one. And perhaps I might add some short reflection to the last answer. What do we select out of the box of our tradition? What's in this box? You said we have to stick to the tradition of the church and not to transform it into something else. Agreed. But how rich is this box we call tradition? What's in there? And we have to do research to look what's in this box. And I give you an example, which I find quite exciting. There is a new translation of the New Testament in German, and they consulted the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. And in the Old New Testament in German, there was, in the Pauline letters, an apostle called Junius, a man. And now they revised the translation with the old manuscripts, and they realized this Junius was in the old manuscripts a Junia, which is in Latin and in Greek a female person. So you have in the new translation an apostle in the Pauline tradition, which is a woman. And that's for me an example to look concisely what's in our box. Don't limit our box too narrow. Have a broad view on what we can find. We shouldn't transform Catholic tradition to something else that it not was and not is. But perhaps there are more ideas, traditions, theological thoughts in it than we imagine.
Thank you very much. Do we have some questions from the floor? How about from our chat box there?
Yes, ma'am. We have another question in our chat box. So this question is, the synodal consultations had realized the gap between the clergy and the laity. Responding to PCP2's emphasis on lay empowerment and considering that the synodal process was an initiative of the Church's hierarchy, how the lay representation was chosen, was there an efficient process that the representation of the lay was from the ranks of the lay, not handpicked by the clergy? Could this be an impact of post-colonial mentality? Once again, the synodal consultations had realized the gap between the clergy and the laity. Responding to PCP2's emphasis on lay empowerment and considering that the synodal process was an initiative of the Church's hierarchy, how the lay representation was chosen. Was there an efficient process that the representation of the lay was from the ranks of the lay, not handpicked by the clergy? Could this be an impact of post-colonial mentality?
Dr. Basas, you'd like to go first?
I think the one who's best suited to answer that is Dr. Trosio because she was present during the national consultation. But just to give my brief thought on that, the point that the church in the Philippines is clericalist has been raised many times already. And whether that is true or not, maybe Dr. Jo can say if there was a scientific study that was made that would indeed validate that claim that the church in the Philippines is in that really clerical mentality. But if we are to appreciate that process where lay people were part of the consultation, I am sure that in the process of consultation, there was really dialogue. There was really an active participation of all the members of the consultation. It is unfair to presume that the laity were dictated upon during the process. I think the bishops or our church leaders are circumspect enough not to allow such things to happen. And then, of course, now Dr. Jo can share her experience during that synod. You can share because you were there.
Okay. So I'm put on the spot here now, right? Yes, we were there. Indeed, what you mentioned, Dr. Bazas, about clericalism, this is an interesting topic to research on. Really, we need an evidence-based study to support the claim and to really understand that, right? But talking about the synodal approach, the synodal process, the participation of the laity, it was indeed very evident during that synodal consultation, at least from my observation and my experience, yes. Thank you. Dr. Zander, you might want to add something or your thoughts, please.
I would like to change my role and don't speak as a theologian, but as a historian and sociologist. In a sociological perspective, you can raise the question, why was Christianity that successful? Right? You know, a small community somewhere in the Mediterranean that became a world religion. And one reason is the establishment of priesthood. You know surely that Paul had the idea everyone is the temple. The Christian is the temple. That means you don't need a temple, you don't need professionals, you don't need priests. And he empowered the individual. That's a great idea, which is deep part of our tradition, but in practice, it's extremely difficult because everyone is responsible for himself. And therefore, priests, let's say professionals, are highly appreciated. And they are one reason of the success of the church. And of course, it's clear that priests who engage her whole life for a community, for the church, who don't get married, who are really in full responsibility with their life for the church, that's an important part of the church. And it's not really reasonable to argue that priesthood is, well, only a point of difficulties. On the other hand, if you read the text of Pope Francis, especially with regard to the curia in Rome, clericalism is a problem. That's part of the professionalization. If you are a priest, you have a good income normally, you have a good social position, and it's attractive to become priest. And so I would say, again, we have to abstain from black and white perceptions. I think, personally, we need priests. We need sociologically spoken professionals because they are an important part of church and of our life. On the other hand, there's always the danger that they become an elitist group and that clericalism is part of this job. And I would say, don't be too clear, too black and white. Realize these ambivalences we have, and we can't live without ambivalences. A world which is only wrong and right and black and white is perhaps a world of the devil. I don't know.
Thank you very much. So to better understand clericalism, we really need some sociological perspective, a historian's perspective. Thank you very much, Dr. Zander. In the interest of time, we can only accommodate one last question from the floor. Anyone, please? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. The question is addressed to Professor Zander. I am Joselito Gutierrez from the UST Institute of Religion. When we speak of comparative theology, does it include dialogues with gender, dialogue with culture, etc.? If not, how can we use the methodology of comparative theology in the talks about gender, culture, and probably we can also include queer? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this obviously last question from the floor. I'm always a bit hesitant if people don't start fighting with me, and thank you very much that you do. What's about gender and these aspects? I think the central point for comparative theology is to understand others as others and not to judge as the first step. That means I have to accept people as they are, as Muslims, as Buddhists, as Protestants, as Catholics, as Filipinos, as whatever. And that includes that in the first step, I have to accept that people declare themselves transgender, gay, lesbian, whatever. And I have to accept this perspective without judging. In a second step, and there differences will begin, I may judge. It's not necessary, but I may judge. And concerning, well, the acceptability of same-sex marriage, of transforming your gender, will be highly controversial. We shall have these discussions, we will have these discussions, and we will be we will have different positions within the Catholic Church. But, and that's my hope, if we do it in a, well, method of comparative theology, we first realize who the others are. We realize they don't take my perspective. I'm married to a woman. For me, and for my personal genesis, same-sex marriage was a thing that didn't exist, and had to learn, even if that's not my way, that there are people who are gay and to try to be married. And it's not my job as a sociologist and as a person to judge, but first to accept and to see people are different. And I hope we'll have a fair and open debate within the church how to judge, how to deal with these things, what to do with people who don't stick to the way most of us or me are living. So that would be my answer, which is again not clear, but just an attempt to open a way to have a fruitful and fair and humane discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Perhaps that ends our open forum. Thank you very much. This has been a very productive afternoon. May we request our speakers to return to their seats for the closing rite. Once again, thank you very much, our dear speakers, Professor Dr. Helmut Zander and Professor Dr. Basas. Thank you very much. This has been a very productive afternoon and a very beautiful way to start our partnership with the University of Fribourg. At this point, we award the Certificate of Appreciation to our distinguished speakers, academic and theologian. May we request Reverend Father Dr. Janelle Abogado, our Vice Rector for Research and Innovation, for the awarding of certificates. Allow me to read the citation. Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas, the Catholic University of the Philippines, through the Office of the Vice Rector for Research and Innovation, Faculty of Sacred Theology, Institute of Religion, and Center for Theology, Religious Studies, and Ethics, and the University of Fribourg, Faculty of Theology, present this Certificate of Appreciation to Dr. Alan Basas for sharing his expertise during the Symposium on Comparative Theology as part of the Project on Global Catholicism held on August 17, 2022 at the Buenaventura Garcia Paredes OP Building, University of Santo Tomas, Manila, Philippines. Signed, Reverend Father Dr. Janelle Abogado, OP, Vice Rector for Research and Innovation, University of Santo Tomas, Coordinator of Regions for Asia-Pacific Region, Order of Preachers, and Professor Dr. Rodel Aligan, Dean, Faculty of Sacred Theology, University of Santo Tomas, and Professor Dr. Helmut Zander, Faculty of Theology, University of Fribourg, Switzerland. Thank you very much and congratulations, Associate Professor Basas. And now we thank our dear speaker and we award this certificate. Allow me again to read the citation. The certificate reads, Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas, the Catholic University of the Philippines, through the Office of the Vice Rector for Research and Innovation, Faculty of Sacred Theology, Institute of Religion, Center for Theology, Religious Studies and Ethics, and the University of Fribourg Faculty of Theology present this certificate of appreciation to Professor Dr. Helmut Zander for sharing his expertise during the Symposium on Comparative Theology as part of the project on Global Catholicism held on August 17, 2022 at the Buenaventura Garcia Paredes OP Building, University of Santo Tomas, Philippines. Signed, Reverend Father Dr. Janelle N. Abogado OP, Vice Rector for Research and Innovation, University of Santo Tomas, and Coordinator of Regents for Asia Pacific Region of the Order of Preachers, and Reverend Father Dr. Rodel E. Aligan, Dean, UST Faculty of Sacred Theology. Once again, thank you very much and congratulations, Professor Dr. Zander. At this juncture, may we call once again on stage Reverend Father Dr. Janelle N. Abogado for his closing remarks. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, the University of Santo Tomas Vice Rector for Research and Innovation.
Good afternoon to everyone. This symposium is envisioned to be a beginning. We hope that more of this will be held in the future with the involvement of professionals and academics from the University of Santo Tomas and the Faculty of Theology of the University of Fribourg, Switzerland, and the other institutions under the care of the Dominican Order. We believe that with the breaking of the grounds during this visit of Professor Helmut Zander to UST, the path has been set for meaningful collaborations. It will surely be beneficial and constructive for the academic staff, researchers, and students of both universities, and other scholars interested in furthering the conversations between and among the philosophy of religion, theology, and dialogue with cultures and religions. The first correspondences that paved the way for today's event were sent in December of last year when I was the director of the Center for Theology, Religious Studies, and Ethics, or CTRSE. I am glad that those initial communications, with the tireless effort of my successor in CTRSE, Professor Joel Sagut, PhD, have led to today's event. This activity, which promotes dialogue between cultures and religions, is at the core of the mission of the Dominicans in this part of the world. Specifically, the General Chapter of the Dominicans at Bien Hoa, Vietnam, in 2019, established a Center of Dialogue for Asian Religions and Cultures, whose activities have been placed under the vigilance of the Master of the Order. The CTRSE has been designated by the same General Chapter to spearhead this apostolate of dialogue. Professor Zander's introduction to us here in UST by his Dominican colleague in the University of Fribourg through the Office of the Assistant to the Master for Intellectual Life, Father Pablo Siculi, was in line with this concern of promoting dialogue. For this reason, we have also invited the members of the Dominican family in the Asia-Pacific region to join us in this event via online. We hope that we shall be able to involve them in the next set of activities so that we can have representations from the other parts of our region to learn their religious experience in conversation with the culture and society to which they belong. I hope the event this afternoon will pave the way for more collaborative activities, promoting the culture of dialogue in the future. so that more and more we become adept at the task of bringing together in our own respective contexts, culture, and religion, and in doing so, discover hopefully a more profound meaning of life and living within the horizon of this multicultural and multi-religion structured society that we are in. I thank everyone who participated in this symposium, those who are physically with us here in this venue, and those who followed this event via Zoom. I especially thank the different offices of the university which contributed to making this activity possible, namely the Faculty of Sacred Theology, Center for Religious Studies and Ethics, and Institute of Religion. Finally, I thank our speakers, Assistant Professor Father Cecilio Vladimir Magbuo, OP, STHD, of the Faculty of Sacred Theology, Associate Professor Alan Basas, STHD, of the Institute of Religion, and Professor Helmut Zander, PhD, of the Faculty of Theology, University of Fribourg, for orienting us to this important theme of dialogue in comparative theology. May the conversation they shared with us today inspire us to become more open to the different voices in our society and ever ready to listen and learn about the stories of the people we encounter. Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat po, Father Janelle. At this point, before we finally close this afternoon symposium, allow us once again to express our sincerest gratitude to the following offices who have made this event possible. Thank you very much to the Vice Rector for Research and Innovation, Vice Rector for Finance, Secretary General, the Communications Bureau, the Education Technology Center, the EdTech Center, Santo Tomas E-Service Providers, Facilities Management Office, Public Affairs Office and UST Museum, and the organizing offices of the Faculty of Sacred Theology, Institute of Religion, the Center for Theology, Religious Studies and Ethics, and the Center of Dialogue for Asian Religions and Cultures. Maraming salamat din po to the technical teams from the Communications Bureau, the Institute of Religion, and the Facilities Management Office. Borrowing from the beautiful words from the statement on the National Synodal Consultation, we end by thanking the Lord as we say how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. We looked, we listened, we are all called to love, and in responding to God's love, we are called anew for mission. Maraming salamat po sa lahat ng nandito at sa lahat ng mga nasa Zoom hanggang sa muli. We now sing the UST hymn.